Huh. That was the first sound my vet made when she ran the scanner over the back of my cat's neck, looked at the small screen on the chip reader, and went quiet for about 6 seconds longer than I would have expected her to. I had been at her practice for a routine wellness visit for my cat, June. June was 14 years old. I had adopted her from a shelter 6 months earlier. She was small, gray, slightly underweight, with one eye that had a faint cloud over it from old age, and she was the most affectionate cat I had ever met. She had purred from the moment the shelter worker had handed her to me, and she had not really stopped since. The vet, a woman named Dr. Pernille Kvist, who had been recommended to me by a coworker, was in her early 50s. She was efficient and quiet. She had been doing the wellness exam for about 10 minutes. She had checked June's teeth, her ears, her weight, her heart, her eyes. She had then picked up the small handheld scanner that vets use to check for the microchip every shelter cat has implanted between the shoulder blades. She had run it over June's neck. The scanner had beeped. She had looked at the screen. She had said, "Huh." She did not say anything else for those 6 seconds. She turned the scanner slightly. She read it again. Then she said, "Ms. Reinhold, when did you change the registered owner name on June's chip?" I said, "I never did. I have not done anything to her chip. I adopted her in January, and I have not even thought about the chip since the shelter told me it was already registered to me." The vet nodded slowly. She looked at the screen again. She turned the scanner around so I could see it. The screen had June's chip number on it. Below the chip number was a name. The name was not mine. The name on the chip was Inger Lindquist. I stared at the screen. I could not for a moment make sense of what I was seeing, because the name on the screen was a name I had not seen written down in 11 years, and the name belonged to my grandmother, who had died in October of 2014 in a small house in this same town when I had been 22 years old and a senior in college, and who had been the first dead person I had ever loved. Hit subscribe before I tell you another word. Drop your city in the comments. Stay until the end of this video. There is something I figured out that afternoon about a 14-year journey a small gray cat made through the world to land back in the lap of the family who had loved her, and the figuring out has changed how I think about everything I thought I had lost. Listen all the way through. I sat in the small exam room and I tried to make my mouth work. I said, "Dr. Kvist, that is my grandmother's name. My grandmother died in 2014. I have not seen that name written on anything in over a decade." Dr. Kvist set the scanner down. She sat on the small stool next to the exam table. She put her hand very gently on June, who was still sitting on the table in the loaf position cats do when they have decided to tolerate being examined. She said, "Tell me about your grandmother. Did she live in this area?" I said, "She lived 4 miles from here. She lived in a small farmhouse on Persimmon Hill Road. She lived there for 38 years. She died there. She had a small gray cat she loved very much. The cat's name was Pearl. The cat went missing the week my grandmother died. We searched for the cat for 3 weeks after the funeral. We never found her. My family assumed a coyote got her. We had assumed it for 11 years. Dr. Kvist was quiet for a long moment. She looked at June. June had not moved. June was looking at me. Dr. Kvist said, "Ms. Reinhold, the chip on this cat was registered in 2010. The registration address was on Persimmon Hill Road. The registered owner was Inger Lindquist. The cat was registered as a female, gray, born approximately 2009. June is 14 years old. The math works. The chip number is unique. The chip is not transferable. This cat was registered to your grandmother 15 years ago, and the registration was never updated because nobody ever brought her back to a vet who could read the chip and update the records. The shelter that placed her with you in January would have run the same scan I just ran. The shelter would have seen the same name I just saw. The shelter would have either not realized that the name on the chip was not yours, or would have realized it and not said anything to you, because the registration was old enough that they assumed it was an inherited family cat and that the paperwork had simply not been updated. I sat in the exam room and I could not speak. Dr. Kvist said, "I am going to leave you alone with her for a few minutes. I am going to go pull up the full chip registry and see what else I can find. Take whatever time you need." She left the room. She closed the door behind her, very quietly. I sat on the small bench in the exam room. I looked at my cat. June looked back at me. I want to tell you what I knew about Pearl, because the knowing is the part of this that has been with me for the last 6 months, and the with-me-ness has shaped how I have been living since. My grandmother had been a woman who took in animals nobody else wanted. She had had cats my entire childhood. The cats had come to her in various ways. Some had been left on her porch as kittens by people in town who knew she would take them in. Some she had pulled out of barns in the middle of winter. One she had picked up on the side of a road in 1996 and had carried home in her cardigan. The cats had lived long lives in her small farmhouse and had died, mostly peacefully, in old age, in her lap or under her bed. Pearl had been her last cat. Pearl had come to her in 2009 from a feral colony behind the IGA in town. My grandmother had been 76. Pearl had been a kitten of about 4 weeks. My grandmother had bottle-fed her for 3 weeks because Pearl had been too small to eat solid food. Pearl had imprinted on my grandmother completely. Pearl had not been a cat who liked other people. Pearl had been a cat who had loved exactly one human in the world, and that human had been my grandmother. I had visited my grandmother every Sunday during my last 2 years of college because she had lived 4 miles from my school, and because she had been the only person in my family who I had not been actively avoiding during those years. My grandmother had not asked me about my grades, or my future plans, or my dating life. She had asked me what I had been reading. She had asked me what I had been thinking about. She had made me coffee, and she had let me sit in her kitchen for hours. And Pearl had usually been on her lap, or on the windowsill, or somewhere in the room where she could keep an eye on my grandmother. My grandmother had died on a Tuesday morning in October of 2014. She had been alone in the house when it happened. She had had a stroke. The neighbor who had checked on her every other day had found her on the kitchen floor on Wednesday afternoon. Pearl had not been in the house when the neighbor had arrived. The back door had been propped open with a brick, the way my grandmother had always propped it during the day so the cat could come and go. Pearl had presumably gone out at some point on Tuesday and had come back to find that the woman she loved was not in the house, and that the house was full of strangers, and that the world she had known for 5 years had stopped existing. My family had searched for her. We had searched for 3 weeks. I had walked the woods around my grandmother's house, calling her name in a voice that had become, over the 3 weeks, smaller and smaller, until it had been a kind of whisper. We had assumed, eventually, that she had been killed by a coyote, or had crossed a road at the wrong moment, or had simply gone into the woods to die because the human she had loved was dead, and she had not wanted to live without her. We had grieved her along with my grandmother. We had grieved her separately. The grief for the cat had been, in some ways, harder to carry than the grief for my grandmother, because my grandmother had been 78 and had been ready to go, and Pearl had been 5 and had not been ready for anything. I had moved away after college. I had taken a job as an adult literacy program coordinator at a community college in Portland, 4 hours away. I had gotten married. The marriage had ended 5 years later. I had moved back to southern Maine in 2023, to a small town 12 miles from my grandmother's old house, because I had wanted to be near family again, and because I had needed to start over in a place where I had once been happy. My grandmother's house had been sold to a stranger years before. I had not gone to look at it. I had not been able to. I had adopted June from the shelter in January because I had been alone in a small apartment for the first time in my adult life and had not wanted to be alone anymore. I had walked through the cat room at the shelter on a Saturday afternoon. I had walked past every other cat. I had stopped in front of June's cage. June had been at the front of the cage. June had been looking at me. June had reached one paw through the bars of the cage and had touched my hand and had not pulled it back. I had asked the shelter worker about her. The shelter worker had told me that June had been brought in the previous October. She had been found by a woman who lived alone on a country road about 30 miles north. The woman had been feeding a small gray cat who had been showing up at her back door for an estimated 4 to 5 years. The woman had finally caught her in a humane trap and had brought her to the shelter because the woman had been moving into assisted living and had not been able to take a cat with her. The cat had been examined, vaccinated, treated for a small ear infection, and assessed for adoption. She had been at the shelter for 3 months by the time I had walked in. I had asked if she was friendly. The shelter worker had laughed. She had said, "She is the most affectionate cat in this building. She has been waiting for somebody. Nobody has wanted her because she is 14 years old and people want kittens. She has been here longer than any other cat in this room, and she is going to get along with you better than any other cat in this room. If you take her, please take her today, because I do not want her to be here for another night." I had taken her home that afternoon. I had named her June because the month I had picked her up was January, and I had been going through a hard winter, and I had wanted to name her after a warmer month I was going to get to with her. She had purred from the moment I had put her in the carrier. She had purred for the entire drive home. She had purred when I had let her out into my apartment. She had purred when she had found a sunny spot on my couch and had fallen asleep. And she had purred in her sleep. And she had purred when she had woken up. And she had been purring, in some form or another, for almost every hour we had spent together for the last 6 months. She had purred on the exam table at the vet that afternoon. She was purring when Dr. Kvist came back into the room 10 minutes after she had left. Dr. Kvist sat down on the stool again. She had a printout in her hand. She gave it to me. She said, "I pulled the full chip history. The chip was registered in March of 2010 to Inger Lindquist at the Persimmon Hill address. The registration was never updated. The chip company has a record of one welfare check on the chip, in November of 2014. Somebody called the chip company a month after your grandmother's death and asked whether the cat had been brought in to a vet anywhere. The company had no record of a recent scan. The caller asked the company to flag the chip with a return to family note. The note has been in the system since November of 2014. The note says, 'If found, please contact,' and there is a phone number. The phone number is your aunt's house. I am going to assume that is your aunt. I am going to assume that your family did everything they could to find this cat in 2014, and that nobody managed to scan her until today, 11 years later, in this office, by accident. Ms. Reinhold, your grandmother's cat is in this room. She has been alive for the entire 11 years. She has been alive somewhere on a country road 30 miles north. She has been being fed by a woman who did not know who she was, because Pearl had been smart enough to find a human who would feed her, and not smart enough to find a human who would take her to a vet and scan her chip, until that woman went into assisted living and brought her to the shelter. The shelter scanned her, saw the old registration, did not flag the discrepancy because it was so old, and put her up for adoption. You walked in. She picked you. The chip is the only reason any of us know what we are looking at. You would have lived your whole life with this cat without knowing who she was. The chip is the reason you are going to know. I sat in the small exam room. I held the printout. June got up from her loaf position. She walked across the exam table. She stepped onto my lap. She turned around twice, the way cats do, and she sat down on my legs, and she put her head against my chest, and she purred. I put my hand on her head. I felt the small bump under her fur between her shoulder blades, where the chip was. I had not noticed the bump before. I had not been looking. I cried in that exam room for a long time. Dr. Kvist did not leave. She sat on the stool with her hands folded in her lap, and she let me cry. June stayed on my lap. June purred the whole time I was crying, the way she had been purring for 6 months, the way she had probably been purring for the 11 years she had spent on a country road 30 miles north, finding a kind woman who fed her until that woman could not feed her anymore, and then waiting in a shelter for somebody to walk in who would take her home. I did not, for a long time, have language for what I was feeling. The closest I have come in the 6 months since is that I had been carrying, since 2014, a small specific grief about a cat who I had not been able to save. The grief had been organized around the assumption that Pearl had died alone in some woods because nobody had known where to look for her. The grief had been a particular shape. The shape had been the shape of a small animal who had been failed by the people who had loved her. The shape of the grief had now been replaced by a different shape. The new shape was the shape of a small animal who had not been failed at all. The new shape was the shape of a cat who had been smart enough to survive, who had found a kind human, who had lived a quiet life on a country road for 11 years, who had been a cat the whole time, who had been fine. The new shape was a shape I did not know how to hold, because the grief had been the shape of an absence, and the new thing was the shape of a presence. And the two shapes were the same animal, and I had been carrying her the whole time, in different forms, without knowing it. I called my aunt that evening. My aunt is my mother's older sister. She is 68. She had been the one who had handled my grandmother's affairs after she died. She had been the one who had called the chip company in 2014. She had been the one who had searched the woods most aggressively. She had been the one who had loved Pearl almost as much as my grandmother had. I told my aunt what had happened. I told her in 7 sentences. I read her the printout. My aunt did not say anything for a long minute. Then she started crying. She cried in the way old women cry when they have been carrying something for 11 years that they did not know they had still been carrying. She said, "Bridget, bring her to me." I drove the cat to my aunt's house that evening. My aunt lives in the same town. She lives in a small ranch house on the other side of the river. I had been to her house many times. I had not been to her house with a cat. I knocked on her door. She opened it. She was already crying. She held out her arms. I handed her June. June, who had been quiet in her carrier for the drive, looked up at my aunt's face. June stretched up. June touched her nose to my aunt's chin, the way cats do when they recognize somebody. My aunt said, "Pearl." The cat, who had been June for 6 months, who had been somebody on a country road for 11 years, who had been Pearl for 5 years before that, settled into my aunt's arms and started purring. I want to tell you what I have come to think about all of this, because the thinking has been the work of the last 6 months, and I am not finished with the work. But I have a small amount of it that I am ready to share. We are taught in this country that grief follows a shape. We lose somebody. We mourn them. We get past it. We move on. The mourning is supposed to be a process that we complete, and then the grief is supposed to be a thing that recedes, and we are supposed to reach a stage at which we can think of the person we lost without breaking open. The process has stages. The stages have names. The stages were named by a woman who did her work in good faith, and who probably did not intend for her work to become the rigid script our culture has turned it into. The script is wrong about something. The script assumes that what we lose is always a person, and that what we lose stays lost. The script does not have a category for the things we lost that come back through doors we did not know we left open. The script does not have language for an 11-year journey a cat takes through the world to land back in the family she came from. The script does not know what to do with a chip in the back of a small gray cat's neck that contains, in its tiny piece of silicon, the name of a dead woman who once loved her. The thing I have come to believe is that grief is not always a process that completes. Sometimes grief is a long, quiet waiting. Sometimes the thing we lost is not lost. Sometimes it is just somewhere else, living a different life, with people we do not know, becoming a slightly different version of itself, until the day comes when the door opens and it walks back through. The door does not always open. Most of the time, the things we lose are gone. Most of the time, the grief is the right shape. Most of the time, the work of mourning is the work of accepting that the thing is not coming back. Sometimes the door opens. Sometimes the thing we lost has been alive the whole time, somewhere we did not know to look. Sometimes the way it comes back is through a routine wellness visit at a small vet's office in a small Maine town, with a chip scanner and an old database entry, and a vet who was patient enough to read the screen carefully and to ask a question that did not have an obvious answer. Pearl is back. She lives at my aunt's house now. My aunt and I had a long conversation about who should keep her, and my aunt was prepared to give her back to me. I did not let her. Pearl is 15 years old. She has been waiting 11 years to come back to her family. The person in the family who was closest to my grandmother, the person who has the most history with Pearl, the person whose house feels the most like the house Pearl came from, is my aunt. My aunt has the same kind of overstuffed couch my grandmother had. My aunt has the same kind of porch with the same kind of brick that props open the same kind of back door. My aunt has been talking to Pearl in the same kind of low voice my grandmother used to talk to her in. Pearl has been responding the way she responded to my grandmother. The two of them are making each other a small new life out of the years they did not get to have. I see Pearl every Sunday. I drive over to my aunt's house. We have coffee. Pearl sits on my aunt's lap or on the windowsill or somewhere in the room where she can keep an eye on my aunt. The pattern is the pattern from my grandmother's kitchen 15 years ago. The pattern has resumed. The pattern is what was waiting. I have a different cat now. I went back to the shelter 3 weeks after I gave Pearl to my aunt. I adopted a young black cat named Magnus, who is 2 years old and who has been with me for 5 months. He is not Pearl. He was not supposed to be Pearl. He is his own cat, and I am the human he picked, and we are starting our own pattern. I want to leave you with one small thing. The vet who scanned the chip, Dr. Kvist, told me, 3 weeks after all of this happened, that she had thought about not asking me when I had changed the owner name. She had thought about just updating the registration to my name, the way she usually did when she ran into old chips, and not saying anything. The discrepancy was old enough that she could have written it off as a paperwork issue. She had decided to ask instead because she had been at her practice for 9 years, and she had developed a habit of asking questions that did not have obvious answers, and the habit had paid off in small ways many times before, and she had not wanted to break the habit just because the answer was probably nothing. The answer was not nothing. The answer was an 11-year reunion that none of us had known was possible. The answer was a cat finding her way back to her family because a vet asked a question she did not have to ask. The small habits we keep, of asking questions that do not have to be asked, of paying attention to old data nobody has told us to pay attention to, of treating routine information as if it might be more than routine, are the habits that produce the moments in our lives that the rest of our lives are organized around. Most of the time, the questions do not have answers. Once in a while, very rarely, the question has an answer that has been waiting in a database for 11 years to be asked. I am asking you, this week, to ask one extra question that you do not have to ask. It does not have to be at a vet's office. It can be anywhere. It can be the question you ask the person at the front desk of your dentist's office about the small framed photograph behind her. It can be the question you ask the older man at the grocery store about the unusual book in his cart. It can be the question you ask your great aunt on the phone about the cousin you have not heard about in 20 years. The question is not going to have an answer most of the time. The question is sometimes going to be an inconvenience. Once in a while, the question is going to open a door you did not know was there. The door is the entire point. I am going to my aunt's house tomorrow. Pearl is going to be on her lap. We are going to drink coffee and look out the window and not say very much. The pattern is going to be the pattern. The pattern is what was waiting. The chip is in a small folder in my aunt's kitchen drawer now. The printout from Dr. Kvist's office is in there too. The folder is not labeled. My aunt and I both know what is in it. We do not need to label it. We are keeping it because the chip is the smallest possible record of the longest possible journey. And the journey ended in a kitchen with a windowsill, and the kitchen is full of light, and the cat is asleep, and the woman who loved her is dead, and the woman who loved her almost as much is alive, and is feeding her tuna out of a small bowl. Some doors stay open, some chips stay valid, some cats find their way home.